Hello, and welcome to Data, TI-Nspire CX Technology, and the Correlation Coefficient. My name is Valerie Hudson, and we are going to work through some data that I collected with some of my Algebra 1 students. So here is the data. Students gave me their heights in inches and their shoe size in men's shoe sizes. So I had female as well as male students. And just for consistency's sake, I had all my students enter their shoe size in men. So the women would subtract 1.5 from their shoe size. Of course, I had more students than just these 5, but just for demonstration purposes today, I wanted to just give you a little bit of data. So on our calculator, from the home screen, I'm going to go to number 1, new. Do I want to save? No, I'm not going to save if your calculator is asking me that. And I am going to add a list and spreadsheet page. So on a list and spreadsheet page, what you have to do is label or name your columns. So since I have height in inches, I could type height, H-E-I-G-H-T, or inches or whatever would be reasonable. And then on column 2, shoe size. Now, since shoe size is 2 words, if I put a space in now, the calculator is not going to accept that. I need an underscore instead, and that's found down here where the question mark is. So shoe size. Now, if I knew an equation right now, I could type that in line 2. I don't have an equation, so I'm just going to come down to the first numbered line and type my values. So I've got 52, I've got 60, I've got 66, 54, and 69 inches. And now I'm going to go back. I've got 4.5, 6.5, 10, 6, and 12. So what I always have my kids do is go back, let's look at our data, make sure we typed everything exactly. So that's what I'm doing right now, just double checking to make sure everything is good. Now, what we don't want is our cursor to look like this, where it's flashing and we've got some highlight in the field. We don't want that because that's the calculator's way of saying, I'm waiting for you to enter your information. Well, obviously I already entered it. So what we want is I'll just press enter. I want a blue box with no flashing cursor around some piece of data. So as long as your cursor is in one of your data columns, that's fine. We do not want it over here where I don't have data because the calculator will not know where to start. So I'm going to come over here. Again, it doesn't matter which column I'm in. So now that I'm finished with my data, let me make this screen a little bit larger. There we go. All right, so next I'm going to menu. I'm going to data, and I'm going to quick graph. Now, notice that quick graph is not like number 4 there, clear data. It's not grayed out. If my cursor was in column C or D where I did not have data, quick graph would be grayed out. I don't want that. So I'm going to come over here to quick graph. Again, it's not grayed out because my cursor is in a column where I had data. And because my cursor was in the shoe size column, that is why shoe size is showing up here in the independent axis. So my students and I would have conversations about, what do you think is dependent on what? Is shoe size depending on height? Is height dependent on shoe size? And we as a class would come up with a determination on what is dependent on what. Generally, it was height is the independent value. So I'm just going to go ahead and change that by clicking on shoe size, changing that to height, and then coming over here to the y-axis and choose shoe size. And I have a very nice graph. Now, just depending on how much data you have, this data and statistics side might look pretty busy, might be kind of hard to see, what's going on with the data. Obviously, not too hard at this point, but what I always like my students to do is change their view. So I am going to doc because we're going to change the look of this document. And what we're going to do is change the way this page is laid out. So that means I'm going to page layout and I'm going to ungroup. So when I ungroup, that means that the listen spreadsheet page is its own page now. And on page 1.2, I have the data and statistics page. So everything is spread out a little bit nicer. Next, I'm going to menu. I am going to analyze because I do want to get some information from this graph. And I'm not going to jump all the way down to regression right now because I want my kids to think a little bit about what would a trend line and a reasonable trend line look like for this data. So I'm going to go to this very first item that's not grayed out, add movable line. And what this is just a random line that's thrown on the page. It has no meaning at all until the student gives it meaning. So if the student moves their cursor to or toward the end of the line, we have this broken circle. And if I press and hold click to grab that end, I can then rotate the line, which is very nice. And I'll let go, and I'm going to go over to this other end. Press and hold click for like a second or two. Slide your finger on the touchpad, and we are now creating our own trend line. If I put my cursor toward the center of the line and grab by pressing and holding click for like a second or two and slide that finger on the touchpad, then we are doing a little translation of our line. And so in this manner, the students have some understanding or can gain some understanding of what the calculator is going to do when we ask for the linear regression. So let's say the student decided on this as the trend line. All right, so we're going to go back. And of course, I would compare what does one student have versus what does other students have, or what do other students have for their trend lines. We're going to go back to menu. We're going to analyze again, and this time we'll go to regression. So obviously we have two regressions, or two linear regressions, I should say. If I was in a statistics class, I would probably choose number 2, but since I did this work in an algebra class, I am going to that first one, mx plus b. And so this is the calculator's line of best fit. If I click on mine here, then obviously going back and forth, I can do some comparisons, and then we can have some really nice, rich discussions with our kids about the differences and similarities between these lines and the equations. Now, this is all well and good, but if we need to know what the correlation coefficient is, we don't have enough information. Now, there is a little bit more information that we could get if we go to settings. So I'm going to go to settings, going back to menu, I'm going to go to settings. And if I click on diagnostics, then I can get the coefficient of determination, but of course, that's not the correlation coefficient. So let's go back to page 1.1. And what I'm going to do is move my cursor over here. It could be in column B, it could be in column C or D. Doesn't really matter. I just don't want it in column A, and we'll see why in just a minute. So I'm just going to put it in column B. And I'm going to go to menu. I'm going to go to statistics, stat calculations, and again, I want this mx plus b linear regression. At this point, I need to tell the calculator, where did I get my independent values and my dependent values? So I'm just going to click over here on this arrow. My independent value is height. My dependent value is shoe size. Notice the regression equation will be saved to F1, so that's important for what's coming up. And the first result column is column C. So those square brackets, that means column on the calculator. And that's important also because my cursor, if you recall, was in column B when I started this linear regression process in the list and spreadsheet page. If my cursor was in column A, then the first result column would be column B where I had data. And of course, I don't want anything to happen to my data. So that's why I said just don't have your cursor in column A. All right, so don't forget, linear regression was saved to F1 because we're going to come back to that. Okay, there we go. And so now I have all my titles for what I'm looking at here in column D. Again, there's that coefficient of determination, but if we're looking for correlation coefficient, then we have to scroll down just one more unit, or one more line, I should say, and we have our correlation coefficient, which does show that we have a strong positive correlation. Wonderful. Now I said we come back to that F1 idea. So what I'm going to do is add a page. So if you notice here above doc, it says plus page. So I'm going to press Control, let it go, and press doc. And I'm going to add a calculator page. So on this calculator page, I can recall that information that was saved back here on 1.1 because it was saved in F1. So that's what I'm going to type, F1. Now notice that when I type that 1, it's bold. So that's the calculator's way of saying, I know that that F1 has a meaning. And that's because we just gave it a meaning. So let's say I wanted to, let me go back to my data. Looking at my students here, since I can see the range and domain of what they entered. Let's say I have, I want to make a prediction of a student who has a height of 58 as far as what their shoe size would be, because that's in our domain. So I'm going to look for F1 of 58. And I get 6.9, which of course is not a shoe size. So we'd have to talk about reasonableness and what would make sense in the context of this problem. But that is our result. We can also go the opposite way. So let's say I have a student who has a shoe size of 11, and I want to know how tall are they? And that would be in our range. So that would make sense. So I'm going to not just type F1, I'm going to need to solve an equation and find the independent value. So to do that, I'm going to go back to menu. I'm going to go to algebra, since all this happened in an algebra class. I'm going to numerical solve, and I'm going to type that F1. Again, it's bold since we gave it a meaning. I don't know what that student's height is, so I'm looking for F1 of X. And I do know that the student's shoe size is 11, so I'm going to type equals 11. Now that's not all. With NSolve, we have to have an equation. I have that, but we also have to reiterate the variable we're looking for. So this comma shows that I have finished my equation, and now I'm going to retype the variable I'm looking for. So that student's height should be approximately 68 inches. Now, of course, we could use our saved F1 equation if we wanted to extrapolate and maybe find the shoe size of someone who was 84 inches tall. Of course, I didn't have anyone in the class that tall, but that is another use that we could have for our equation. Now, one other thing that we can do on this calculator page, if we did not find our correlation coefficient over here on the list and spreadsheet page, we can definitely find that here on the calculator page. So from here, if I did not find that correlation coefficient earlier, I can go to menu, I can go to statistics, I can go to stat calculations, again, choose the appropriate linear regression that you would like. And again, we have to call up what was independent, what was dependent. Now notice the regression equation this time is going to be saved to F2. It's going to be the same equation, but just notice that even if you go through the calculator page to find your statistical information, you can still get it and you can still save it, which is very nice. And now I'm going to press OK, and then I have all of my statistical information. Well, thank you very much for spending a few minutes with me, and I hope that you learned something that you can use with your students.